All right, I think we might start while people are trickling in. So I hope everyone can hear me, but if you can't hear me, just send a message or let me know in the chat. So welcome everyone to this event, which is going to be about whether we should be able to choose what COVID-19 vaccine we receive. And this event is part of the Oxford Uehiro Centre for Practical Ethics Festival, inaugural Festival of Arguments. So before we begin, let me mention just a couple of things. So first, I really like to encourage everyone to complete the feedback form after you've attended this session, or if you're also going to attend a session tomorrow, then after tomorrow's session. So we'll post the link to the feedback form in the chat at some point, and you can also find it on the main website of the festival. So it's really important for us if people fill this in, so we would really appreciate it if you can do that. It won't take long. And the second point is this. So we're about to discuss topics in, such as abortion that may be more emotive for some than others. So what I would like to remind everyone that in order to have a good discussion, we need to be respectful of one another's viewpoints. Okay, so let me introduce you to our two speakers tonight. So first of all, we have Professor David Albert Jones, who's a professor in bioethics at St. Mary's University in Twickenham. And he's also the director of the Anscombe Bioethics Centre here in Oxford, which is the National Research Centre in Bioethics for the Catholic Church. And he's also a research fellow at Blackfriars Hall, also in Oxford. And in addition, he's also vice chair of the Ministry of Defence Research Ethics Committee. And especially of relevance to the current debate, he has been a regular participant at meetings of the Moral and Ethical Advisory Group, which provides independent advice to the UK government on moral, ethical and faith considerations on health and social care related issues. Professor Jones has published on many issues in bioethics, but is probably most widely known for his work on ethics regarding the beginning and the end of life. Now, our other speaker is Dr. Alberto Giubilini, who is a senior research fellow at the Oxford Uehiro Centre for Practical Ethics. And Dr. Giubilini is currently the principal investigator on a UKRI-funded project on what sort of exit strategy we should adopt, like how we should get out of this lockdown safely. And Dr. Giubilini has also worked on many issues in bioethics, but is probably most widely known for his work on the ethics of abortion and conscientious objections and vaccination. So he's also the author of a book entitled The Ethics of Vaccination, published by Routledge in 2019. And this is an open access book, so everyone can read it for free. Now, what may be useful to know is that our speakers, though they have worked on very similar topics, rarely agree on these matters, and they have very different viewpoints. And that's why it's so fantastic that they've decided to come together here tonight to try to look for aspects of the debate where they might actually find some agreement on. So, and this is really important to move the debate forward. And so before I give the word to Professor Jones, I would just like to clarify that you can ask questions throughout this session. There'll be plenty of time afterwards for discussion, but you can post questions at any point. And the best way to do that is to post them in the Q&A. You can see it on the bottom of your screen, and then I'll read the questions to our speakers. All right, Professor Jones, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much for that introduction. As the topic we have, the title that we have is Should People Be Allowed a Choice of Vaccine? So in the first place, I'm going to set out the argument as I see it in favor of a choice between COVID-19 vaccines, where the choice is one based on serious reasons of conscience, in particular, the particular issue being conscience issues in relation to abortion. So to start with, to announce a context which we're all familiar with, over the last year, worldwide, more than 2 million people have died of COVID-19, and hundreds of millions of people have suffered the effects of lockdown, separation, isolation, deprivation. Vaccines are part of the promise of allowing society and the economy to reopen without the risk of another terrible wave of deaths. They're not the whole answer, but in terms of how people are thinking at the moment, they're a key part of a route out of lockdown. Vaccines, as it were, will give us our world back. At least that's the hope. A year ago, it was not certain that there would be any vaccine produced, that we would be able to have any vaccine. But thanks to global efforts by national governments, by multinational companies, by international organizations, and most of all by many, many scientists, there are at least a dozen different vaccines currently in production, and potentially, half a dozen maybe at the moment, potentially at least a dozen more in the pipeline. This on the whole is a good news story, and nothing which I say is intended to criticize the aim of developing vaccines against lethal diseases such as COVID-19. I want to focus, however, on the ethics of vaccine production and vaccine delivery, on how we can deliver a program of vaccination effectively and ethically. And the first point I want to make is that vaccines are medicines. Might seem obvious, but it's something worth saying. Vaccines are medicines, and it is a fundamental principle of medical ethics that we have the right to decide whether to accept or decline the offer of a medicine. All medicines carry side effects, and it is the patient who bears the risk of the medicine or the risk of not taking the medicine. Only in very rare circumstances can an adult be compelled to take a medicine. And normally only when the person is suffering from severe mental illness or otherwise mentally capacitated. It is true that vaccines are not only there to protect the person, but also to protect others as a public health measure. However, if I have a right to anything, I have a right to bodily integrity. That's a kind of fundamental right. And the state does not have a right to use my body medically for the sake of others. And this becomes very clear when we think of medical research. It is always wrong to conduct medical experiments on people against their wishes and without their consent, even if it would benefit others. So the right to refuse medicines is a kind of fundamental right. Vaccines are medicines, and medicines should not be given to competent adults without informed consent. In the 19th century, in the United Kingdom, there were laws passed that made childhood vaccinations, children not able to themselves consent, but their parents, but to make childhood vaccination mandatory for certain diseases. However, these laws were deeply unpopular, and arguably they were counterproductive, and they reduced public trust, and eventually they were repealed. And vaccinations didn't decline as a result of that, but have improved as a result of that, or after that, not necessarily as a result, in the United Kingdom at least. But this debate is not about compulsory vaccination. It's about the issue of choice. Choice to choice to refuse a vaccine or not, but choice between vaccines. Nevertheless, you could think of these issues as related. If I can refuse vaccine A, why can't I choose to accept vaccine B while refusing vaccine A? So there seems to be a link at least. And indeed, if doctors wish to encourage vaccination, it might be better to give people a choice of vaccine if the alternative is that some people might be unvaccinated. My second point is that we should respect a decision that people make to decline medical treatment for reasons of conscience. So let us say that I have kidney disease and that I need a transplant. And somebody says to me, they can get me a kidney, no questions asked. But the kidney would come from a country that's taking kidneys from prisoners or on the black market or so on. Alas, this is not wholly a fictional example. There are things like this that happen. If I were offered a kidney from such a source, I should decline it, and others should respect my refusal. And indeed, I shouldn't be deprived of reasonable alternative treatments because I have refused a treatment which goes against my conscience. But what has any of this got to do with vaccines, and what has any of this got to do with abortion? Because we had abortion in our title. Well, the connection has to do with cell lines. One way to make a cell line is to take cells from the remains of a child who's been aborted, from an aborted fetus. And this has happened a number of times. And in 1972, a baby girl was aborted and cells were taken from her kidney, and they were used to make a cell line. The cell line is called HEC293, HEC for human embryonic kidney. It's from the kidney of actually not an embryo, a fetus. So the HEC293 cells are used widely in research, and sometimes they're used in the manufacture of vaccines or in other medical products. And it so happens that the AstraZeneca vaccine against COVID-19 was developed using HEC293 cells and uses these cells in its production. I say this as someone who is English and indeed Oxonian, and I would like to be proud of the AstraZeneca vaccine, and in some ways I am, but I am not proud of the way in which it has been produced, which depends on abortion. I know it's not the case that there are parts of an aborted baby in the vaccine itself, but nevertheless there is a real connection here. It's not so much a physical connection as an ethical connection. It's about the original instrumentalization of the remains of this child, and the use of that cell line is therefore a failure, or at least for some people it's a failure to respect that original death. In contrast, the Pfizer vaccine was not produced in this way. It is true that the Pfizer vaccine has subsequently been tested using abortion-derived cell lines, but it is not dependent in its production, at least not in its initial production, on abortion-derived cells. And in this respect, it is less, at least, ethically problematic for someone who thinks that abortion is ethically problematic. Someone who regards abortion as seriously wrong, which obviously some people do, would be reluctant to accept a vaccine which was dependent on abortion, even if remotely, if they could reasonably avoid it. Perhaps they would take it if there was no alternative, but they would want an alternative if there was one available. Furthermore, without this alternative, some people might prefer not to be vaccinated. Now, this is a complex question because it's not about an abortion which is happening now or even in the future, but about one that happened many decades ago. And in this way, it's a bit like other issues of complicity with what has happened in the past, issues which politically have become important recently on other issues, how much we're complicit in things which have happened in the past from which we benefit. So these are complex questions, but at least some people wish to dissociate themselves from actions in the past. And that is partly because the actions in the past are not safely in the past, but such practices and actions continue. Now, I'm not aiming here to address directly the question of abortion, and certainly not to change anybody's views about abortion in this short time. Abortion is a topic on which people have very deeply held views, and on which some people may be affected personally, or those close to them may be. And so these kind of, considering these things is not something that can be done quickly. But I think we can agree that abortion is a serious moral or ethical issue. It is a matter of conscience, if anything is a matter of conscience. And if we are to live together and respect one another, we need to accommodate diversity in matters of conscience, such as abortion. At the very least, I don't think that we should exclude people from healthcare because of their views on conscience in relation to abortion. And not offering a choice of vaccine may, for at least some people, effectively be excluding them from healthcare because of their views on abortion. So I've argued that the development of vaccines against COVID-19 is itself something positive, but the vaccine should be developed in an ethical way and delivered in an ethical way. And in particular, I have argued that people who object to vaccines using abortion-derived cells should be offered an alternative vaccine where it is practical for this to happen. And this is for three reasons. In the first place, because vaccines are medicines. And because they are medicines, you should have a right to refuse them. And indeed, with other medicines, if you have two medicines with similar effects, and one is not acceptable to the patient, then the patient should be provided with a reasonable alternative where there is a reasonable alternative. This is part of ordinary medical treatment. In the second place, because of respect for conscience, when people have very different views, while people have very different views on abortion, there is agreement that this is a morally serious issue. Issues of such seriousness, issues of conscience, should be reasonably accommodated when they can be accommodated in order to have an inclusive community. Vaccines are medicines, and access to medicines shouldn't be made dependent on violating one's conscience where there is a reasonable alternative available. And at least in this country, in the case of COVID-19, there are two vaccines, AstraZeneca and Pfizer, both of which are widely available and widely used, and there are millions of doses of both. Millions of people have had doses of both, of one or the other. In the third place, because vaccines need broad public support. The greatest danger, I think, to a vaccination program is that it in some ways alienates individuals or communities or weakens public trust. If people think that the government isn't taking them seriously, isn't taking their concerns seriously, but is just pushing its own agenda regardless, then you have the possibility of an undermining of trust. Happily, in the United Kingdom, we have some of the highest rates of acceptance of vaccination in the world, but rates of acceptance are much lower in other parts of Europe and in America, where vaccine reluctance remains high. And the World Health Organization identifies vaccine reluctance as a major health threat into the next century. This is a global challenge. And I would argue that accommodating conscientious beliefs is a way to increase the number of people who support vaccination. It is helping it is helping in this very large global challenge of encouraging support for vaccination campaigns. So it's not one against the other, it's potentially at least a win-win. So in short, where people have serious concerns of conscience about one vaccine and no concerns or less concerns about another, then both for their sake and for the sake of the community, they should be offered an alternative vaccine where it is practical for that to happen, as I think it is practical for that to happen with these vaccines in this country. And there I'll rest my case. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Alberto, I think it's your turn now.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so the point of this discussion is to try to find areas of agreement. So obviously, David and I disagree on many things, including this one, but it's important to state that what we want to do is to try to find what we actually agree on, which might be very little, but it's important to point it out. So I will state my case, and then, so it would be tempting for me now to respond point by point to what he said, but I will try to make my case, trying not so much to bring up the disagreement, but so to respond to his points, but to highlight the points of agreement. Now, I will skip all the introduction about how bad COVID is because David covered it already. So we all know that we have a big problem, which is an understatement. So there are two things to consider when we talk about freedom of choice and vaccination. So two different issues that are somehow related, but it's important to keep them distinct, separate for the purpose of this discussion. So one is whether the vaccine should be, like any of these COVID-19 vaccines should be mandatory, or like in some form or another, say in the form of vaccine passports, for example. That's one issue. This is not what we are going to discuss, although I suspect that we will need to cover a bit of that. But the second issue is, once we have decided that either the vaccine is mandatory or is not mandatory, but people want to take it. So if people are going to get this vaccine, either because they want to be protected or because they are forced by the state, then should they be able to choose which one? Now, I find it interesting that I'm having this discussion with David, because when we had these discussions in the past on things about abortion, I was on the pro-choice side and he was on the opposite side. Now he's the pro-choice one when it comes to vaccines. I'm not pro-choice when it comes to vaccine because so we need to, like with every public health measure, we need to strike a balance between three different things. One is the individual interest and individual freedom. The second is the interest of other single individuals that we might interact with in our normal life. And the third one is the collective interest, so the public good. Now, it's always a matter of striking a balance between these things. For example, whether or not vaccination should be mandatory or whether or not we should have vaccination passports depends on whether my interest in making a choice on whether or not to be vaccinated outweighs, the right of other people or other individuals to be protected from the virus. So, for example, some people cannot be vaccinated. We shouldn't forget that some people cannot get this vaccine, so they need to be protected somehow for medical reasons or for age reasons. And we need to ideally get to herd immunity or to a high enough level of collective immunity. That's the collective interest, so that society can go back to normality. So we need to strike a balance. So does the value of freedom outweighs these values? Well, it depends on many things. So how many people are willing to get the vaccine and so on. The same applies when it comes to the choice of which vaccine. So is your individual interest in choosing the vaccine because of your own personal, moral, or religious beliefs more important than the interest in other people in being protected, and the collective interest of the public good, and for example, the interest of the healthcare system? Now, there are three things to consider here. First of all, is the cost of the vaccine. So different vaccines have different costs. The second is the availability of the vaccine, of different vaccines at any one time. And the third one is which kinds of groups we want to target with different vaccines. So let me go, because these three aspects are what determines how we should strike the balance between individual interest, other people's interest, and collective interest. So first of all, cost of the vaccine, so money. As it happens, unfortunately, the vaccine that many religious people would consider the most ethically problematic is the Oxford AstraZeneca one, as David said. That also happens to be the cheapest. So that costs much less to the healthcare system. One dose of the AstraZeneca vaccine costs, I think, is £2 or £3. One dose of the Pfizer vaccine, which is less ethically problematic for some religious people, costs between 25 and 40. Sorry, not pound, dollars. So we're talking about $2, $3 versus 25, $35 per dose. All the other vaccines are much more expensive than the Oxford one, the AstraZeneca one. But that's also the one that is considered most ethically problematic because of its connection to abortion. So if you choose your vaccine, assuming there is enough availability for other people of any vaccine, and there is no public health cost in that respect, if you choose your ethical vaccine, then you're imposing a cost on the healthcare system, which means on everyone else, on me, on society as well, on a healthcare system that is already struggling to cope with this pandemic. So is the cost you impose on the healthcare system and on society justifiable? No, does your freedom to choose your vaccine based on your conscience so important to justify imposing this extra cost on the healthcare system? The second thing is that it's not true at the moment that there is ample availability of any vaccine. So when you go to get vaccinated now, you get whatever vaccine the center where you get the where you'll be vaccinated has at the moment. So there is a lot going on about vaccines politics these days. So you might have heard the news. There might be a shortage of supply of the AstraZeneca vaccine. Sorry, I muted. That's a mistake. By choosing your own vaccine, you might take that vaccine, a certain vaccine, away from other people. If you choose the Pfizer vaccine, for example, when you would otherwise be offered the Oxford vaccine, that might mean that the Pfizer vaccine is not going to someone else. So that we are not at the point where we have that variety and that availability that we can really move vaccines around in this way. We might get at some point in the future, but not now. The third thing is that at some point we might want to decide to give different vaccines to different groups of people, because different vaccines have different efficacy on different groups. So the Oxford vaccine apparently works a bit better on younger people. The Pfizer vaccine a bit better on the older people. Different vaccines that might come up might have slightly different profile. So the Oxford vaccine is 100% effective basically at preventing hospitalization among the elderly, but it's only, I think, 76% at preventing actual infection. So you might want to give vaccines to different groups based on these considerations of public health. If you allow people free choice of the vaccine, you might compromise these kinds of strategies. So this is another aspect to consider. It's about the collective interest. So the question how you strike a balance is, in my view, is the following. So it's true that freedom of choice is an important value in our society, and that includes freedom of choice of which vaccine to get. I wouldn't bring up the issue around the vaccine being a medical intervention in this case, because we are talking about a situation where we already decide that people are going to get the vaccine. The choice is about which vaccine. So if people are okay with being vaccinated, but they only have problems with which vaccine, then the thing about bodily integrity, I don't think that applies. So this is no longer about bodily integrity, it's about some other kind of freedom. So bodily integrity is not the issue here, it's the freedom of the vaccine. But I agree, the freedom of choice matters. So this is the point of agreement I have with David. So it's important that people are free to choose which vaccine to get on certain conditions. So, and this is where I part way with David. So because of what I said so far, I think it's permissible to allow people freedom of choice. First of all, if they cover the cost of it. So if they pay the difference between the vaccine they would, the vaccine they want and the vaccine they would otherwise be offered. So if the Pfizer vaccine is more than 10 times more expensive than the AstraZeneca vaccine, and you want the Pfizer vaccine for reasons of conscience, then it is fair that you can do it if the other two conditions are met, if the vaccine is available. But it's fair to ask people to pay the difference for that, because otherwise a big cost that you would pose to society, especially if many people choose that vaccine. The second thing is that I think it's good to we should allow freedom of choice if this condition is met, and if this doesn't compromise public health strategies based on distribution of the vaccine, different vaccines on different groups. And third, if your choice of getting your preferred vaccine doesn't affect other people's opportunity, chances to get any vaccine at the time where they're supposed to get it. So this is as I see, the best way of striking a right balance between freedom of choice, other people's interest, and collective interest. So your freedom of choice should not stand in the way of public health strategies, of other people's rights, and shouldn't impose a too high cost on society. So on these conditions, we should allow freedom of choice. It is worth mentioning, though, that if we agree on this, or even if you don't agree with me, even if you do agree with David, that we should have basically limited freedom of choice, we must have to consider that people might want to choose their vaccine for ethical reasons that are not religious. So we've talked about abortion in this case. I don't see any good reason why religious opposition to vaccines based on abortion should be different from any other form of ethical objection to certain kinds of vaccine that people have. For example, some people might have non-religious objections to certain vaccines because of some objections to some kinds of animal experimentations, for example, or certain uses of animals at some point during research and development of vaccines. Some people might have ethical objections against capitalistic systems or American corporations making profit in a pandemic, which AstraZeneca is not doing as the pandemic lasts, but Pfizer is doing. So I might have ethical objections against this capitalism. You can think of many kinds of ethical objections to not so much to vaccination itself, but to specific vaccines. So if we allow freedom of choice, either on the conditions I've set or are limited, as David says, we should allow freedom of choice to all these people, because otherwise we would have a form of religious privilege, will be a form of unfair discrimination towards non-religious people. Problem is that if we do that, then we might have too many people objecting to specific vaccines. That might really make it difficult to accommodate all the objections, all the requests for the vaccines, and meeting the conditions that I have set. I don't know if I've spoken for 15 minutes, but that might be a good time to stop. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Alberto. So I think, David, I think you have a chance to respond to some of the points maybe that Alberto made.
Thank you. I do think that as a general philosophical truth, all disagreement presupposes an underlying agreement. I think it is simply impossible to disagree with someone unless you agree with what it is that you're disagreeing about. And I think that we tend to forget this because we notice contrasts and we forget the agreed background against which those contrasts are meaningful. But without an agreed background, there aren't any meaningful contrasts. So I think that very often we have agreements, but we don't necessarily advert to them. And I think it's with that attitude in mind that I'm going to look for where we agree, and to try to find things that we genuinely agree about, not just superficially, and we agree that are important, and that we agree are relevant to this issue. So the first thing I'd like to highlight, which I mentioned, but I think Alberto did clarified better, was the possibility of distinguishing the right to decline to be vaccinated and the right of choice of vaccine. That these are two things that you could, do we have a right to say, I don't want to be vaccinated? And do we have a right to choose between vaccines? And they're two separate questions. Because they're two separate questions, I think it is possible, and I think that we would agree about this, though we would not, neither of us were explicit about it. I think it would be possible to give different answers to those two, and indeed that there will be four possibilities, therefore. Either that there is a right to refuse vaccination, and a right to choose between vaccines, as a libertarian might think. Or you have a right to refuse vaccination, but you don't have a right, if you're going to be vaccinated, to choose which one. Or you have no right to refuse vaccination, but if you have a vaccine, you are allowed to choose which one. Or you have no right to refuse vaccination and no right to choose which one. So those are four possibilities, and they're all, you could imagine four different people having these four different possibilities. So I think it is useful to distinguish those questions. I think we agree that those are different questions, and we agree that the question before us today is not whether vaccines should be mandatory, but is whether we should be allowed a choice. And I also agree, and I think I came to agree more strongly as I listened to Alberto, that the issue of bodily integrity, with which I started, is really more about the first question than the second. And the second question, the choice between vaccines, isn't about bodily integrity, whatever else it is about. So they're slightly different questions, and the consideration, the thing that we're interested in is about the choice between vaccines. I think we agree in relation to this second question that when public authorities offer a vaccine, they should consider in the first place not what vaccine each person might want, given a choice, but what would be most effective for the protection of the population. I agree that's where we should start. I think we would agree, though neither of us said it explicitly, that the priority should be the protection of the most vulnerable in the population. But what we agreed about, I think what we did agree about more clearly was that those general considerations about the population should be the first question. We also agree behind this, and this is a very fundamental point of agreement between ourselves, I think, that vaccination is a matter of public health, that it is a great potential benefit to the population, and that it is something that not just all things being equal, one should be in favor of, but it is a great good that one should be in favor of, and therefore be very careful about things which might compromise it. So I think we're arguing on the basis that vaccination is something good and to be encouraged. Yeah, we're arguing on the basis that I almost said but, I'm not going to say but. We agree that it's something that is good and to be encouraged. We also agree that giving people a choice is in itself a good thing, and we agree that this good thing of individual choice needs to be placed in the context of other considerations of availability, cost, and effectiveness. So the good of choice is a good if it's practical, but the if it's practical is important. We agree on that. We agree that public authorities should consider first these public goods rather than first the individual good of choice. The individual good of choice between vaccines is in this sense a secondary consideration. I think we agree that it's a secondary consideration. We also agree that whatever approach we take to this issue, we should be consistent in applying it to other ethical objections, whether or not the ethical objection is or is thought to be associated with a religious belief. So we should be consistent about how we think about different objections. I can think, for example, of someone who was in Italy, say, who might object to a vaccine developed in Russia, as the Italian government is thinking of doing. I can imagine individuals who are concerned about the way in which the vaccine was produced, or who are concerned about the particular politics and human rights of that country, and why a decision had been made to choose that vaccine, which is different to the choices that other European countries had made. So I think that somebody might have such objections, and we should, I think we agree that we should deal with those objections in the same way that we deal with other objections. We should have a consistent view of how we look at these objections. We agree, I think, therefore, that whatever considerations we bring in favor or against choice between vaccines should be applied consistently across different ethical objections. And we agree that choice between vaccines is itself a good if it can be made compatible with the other goods, the good of vaccination program as a whole. I think I will stop there because of our time limit, but I'm not stopping because I've run out of things to agree with Alberto about. I think I could find other things to agree with him about, but I'm aware of the limits of time, so I will stop agreeing at this point and hand over to Alberto.
Thank you. Well, that's a very unusual situation that I find myself agreeing with David on so many things. So let me add one thing on which I think we do agree, and maybe wasn't too clear. I mean, maybe I didn't emphasize it enough in my talk. So I also agree, and I think I also agree with you on the fact that we should, as a society, pay some small cost to allow freedom of choice and freedom of conscience. So you brought up some areas of agreement that I agree on the agreement that we have on public health considerations taking priority. So you're saying we should respect freedom of conscience, other things being equal. So as long as that doesn't compromise vaccine uptake, vaccine supply. I mentioned the aspect of the cost of the vaccine, which you didn't touch on in your response. So I think that if we value freedom of choice, including religious freedom, but not just religious, like freedom of conscience, then we should be prepared as a society, as a collective, to pay some cost for it. So if one vaccine is more expensive than the other, but some people, for reasons of conscience, would want that vaccine, I think we should pay some cost for that, because freedom of conscience is important, and often doesn't come for free. The problem, I think, is we need to decide how much we should be prepared to pay. That depends on two things. First of all, how many people would want that freedom of choice? And if we think of all the people that are opposed to abortion, only the people who are opposed to abortion for religious reasons, that would be a lot of people. And the second thing, we need to think of what the difference in cost is between the vaccines. So the difference between Pfizer and AstraZeneca is huge. So if it was a matter of maybe $1 per dose, that's closer to the acceptable end of the range. If we talk about 10 times, even like more than 10 times more expensive, that seems to be closer to the unacceptable end of the range. Now, I don't know where we should draw a line of the acceptable cost. I agree we should pay some cost for that. I would really, maybe that's a discussion we might want to have, how much we should. So suppose, taking a very extreme case, suppose there is an ethical, completely ethical vaccine. What you would consider, I think all these vaccines are ethical, good, effective, we should have them. Give me whatever you have to. But in your view, if your ethical vaccine costed $1,000, say, extreme case, and the most unethical one costed $1, so do you think we should still pay for that? Because that's an extreme case, and that's, to me, I think most people will agree that's not acceptable. But then, no, we need to decide at which point it becomes unacceptable, because the pandemic really, and the response to the pandemic is really about saving public health resources, because we have spent so much. So we need to do the best we can using the limited resources we have. So the NHS has already been drained, also financially, for this pandemic. Spending more money to that extent for something like freedom of conscience, I think we should. I don't think we should to the extent that the cost of the vaccines would require. But this I'm happy to have a conversation about this. Do you have time for one thing? Or I think I used it. Okay, so one thing. So we're talking about vaccine, the choice of the vaccine here. I don't know to what extent David would agree with this thing I'm about to say. I suspect he would agree, but then he might need to be consistent. So there are all sorts of research there has been a lot of research in the past and practice that have been obviously unethical. So say Nazi experiments, the famous Tuskegee case, for example. But some of the results from that research is being used in like subsequent research and is proven to be useful. Now, there is a debate about whether we should use the results of past unethical experiment, unethical research to benefit people today. So the guidelines that we have these days, most guidelines say that it is permissible to do that if the research if the use we are making now of those results can benefit people significantly. Now, even if I agree with you that abortion is unethical, so two things we need to agree. First of all, that abortion is always unethical, and I disagree. And second thing is that even if it is unethical, the link between abortion and vaccines makes vaccines unethical. So assuming that assuming that I agree with you on this is unethical, but then we will have the same problem as the one we have now with using and benefiting from research now and from the outcomes of research that uses past unethical research. So if we think it's not unethical to use the results of obviously unethical research in the past in Nazi experiments to significantly benefit people today, why wouldn't we apply that to abortion as well? So abortion was unethical, let's assume for the sake of argument. So the research on these vaccines is unethical, but we can benefit many people. So the vaccine is here. You might have objected to developing the vaccine before, but now the vaccine is here. So why would that be different?
Katrine, may may I answer him, because it's another point of agreement?
Yeah, sorry, this deviates a bit from the format, but then we, yes.
I think it's fine to answer that question because it's an important question.
Yeah.
I agree that the question of complicity in past actions, and I adverted to this briefly, but I didn't really say much about it, makes it a much more complex issue and not a straightforward issue. And as you know, as a point of information, this is something which is of which there's a heated debate within the Catholic Church among people who are opposed to abortion as to how far you should go to try to dissociate yourself from it. And this is analogous to other debates that people have in other areas where they think that something was bad, but they don't want to be associated with it. I think that the issue that you have is about the difference between practices that are safely in the past, like Nazism, and issues which are not safely in the past, but they're ongoing, shall we say, attitudes to race. So I think that people, when they think about slavery and statues, the reason why this is a present debate is not because of that we might benefit from from slavery in the past, but because there are ongoing questions about race in society now. And there's the question about how our attitude to the past shapes those things. And so I think that it's the same in relation to abortion. It is the case that both in terms of fetal research and in terms of use of embryos, tissue from abortion, but also embryos from in vitro fertilization are being used in science currently, presently, and in the future. So it's not just safely in the past. And also there are some things which are more involved than others. So it is true, and this is why it's a matter of choice. It is true, and I agree, where you don't have a choice, it is reasonable to accept it. The question then becomes, well, where you do have a choice and you're able to say, therefore, I want to show that where I can distinguish between these two, I wish to accept this because it's less associated, that you can do so. But I agree that mainly I agree with your point that the fact that it's about complicity in the past makes it a more complex question, and one that therefore is not something that all people who object to abortion agree about. This is actually a percentage of people who would not take a vaccine for this reason. The Pope, for example, is in favour of the use of AstraZeneca when there's no practical alternative. So what's practical is the question.
Okay. Thanks, David. Maybe I'll ask some questions. There are some questions from the audience, so maybe we can start with that, and then if there's time left, you can always comment on each other's on the points that you just made. Okay, I'm just going to start with a question that I think is most relevant to the discussion you just had. It's actually maybe a disagreement about an empirical fact. So it's a question from a public health consultant who stresses that their concern is, of course, maximizing vaccination uptake, partly because this will reduce demand on acute healthcare services, which represents an economic saving to the health economy. And I think the concern is that if the choice of vaccine increases uptake, the economic savings in terms of reduced demand for healthcare will be far more than the additional costs of giving a choice of vaccine. So in that case, the argument that giving freedom of choice in vaccines will be more expensive doesn't really stand. So this is, of course, an empirical issue. I don't know whether you would like to say something about that, Alberto.
Yeah, so this is about an instrumental value of, so there are two ways why you think freedom of choice is important. One is intrinsic. So if you think intrinsic is important to give people freedom, and this is what David was and I were talking about mostly. Well, David also brought up this other aspect, which is the instrumental value of freedom. Well, in that case, I would agree. So if it's an empirical matter, if giving freedom of choice would be overall better from the point of view of public health, which means higher vaccine uptake, then I will be in favor of that. My suspect, so we don't, no one knows about it, we don't know, but my suspect is that this might be true when we have enough availability of different vaccines so that giving people freedom of choice doesn't compromise the whole vaccination strategy. So while vaccine doses are limited, I'm really not sure that the instrumental value of freedom of choice would outweigh the importance of an effective vaccine rollout. So it might well be the case. If that's the case, then I would be in favor of giving people choice, but not because freedom of choice of vaccine is important in itself. I don't think, well, is that important? I think it's important, but not that important in itself, but because of an instrumental value. So we need to distinguish between intrinsic value of freedom and instrumental value of freedom.
So though there was a but at the end, if I ignore that and go to the beginning, I think we agree that some of these questions are empirical. Does it actually increase or does it not increase? And it's not obvious, and they might be different in different areas for different countries. But in some circumstances, if it's shown that empirically giving choice also increases increases uptake, then we have two reasons to be in favor of it. A big important one, which is to do with uptake, and one which we agree is less important, but it is still a good thing, which is choice. So the two things actually might pull in the same direction, but whether they pull in the same direction is partly an empirical question. And it may be that it's different in different places or at different times. I think do we agree about that? I think.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, I'm thinking of whether we actually agree on everything. I think, yeah, I agree 100% basically on what you just said. Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you for that. So another question is, the NHS already accommodates patient choices where reasonable, which carries a higher cost at times. How can we then make an argument on cost saving during a global pandemic?
Should I go for, yeah. So, well, how we can make an argument about cost saving during a pandemic? I think the pandemic strengthened the case for cost saving argument, because we have used so much of public health resources. I think cost saving is an important aspect of pandemic management. But the point about accommodating people's choices, so I think this is related to what I was saying before about the thing with David and I agree on, is that we should spend some money to accommodate freedom, something. We should prepare to pay a cost for that. But as I was saying before, the problem is how much, because here we're talking about vaccines that are 10 times or 15 times more expensive than, say, the AstraZeneca one. So I agree we should accommodate conscience, and David would agree with that. The real question is about how much we should pay for that.
So if I can try bring something else up, which I think that we would agree about, which I think is more relevant than the question of financial cost, and that's cost in terms of time and inconvenience. Because what's hugely important in the rollout, and one of the reasons that rollout has been successful in the United Kingdom is its simplicity, and choice interferes with that. And I agree that choice so this is me saying I agree that choice can have costs, but one of the big costs is the cost in logistical terms to roll out. And therefore, if you get the call for the vaccine and you go to the vaccine, then you get what you're given. If one of the kind of ways in which somebody may pay a cost might be that they don't get it when everybody else gets it in an easy way. They have to get it in an inconvenient way, in an inconvenient place, at not the time of their choice, and so on. So the convenience and cost and timeliness, that these are very important for the rollout, but they are also kinds of costs that somebody might bear. And somebody might, for example, bear the cost of having to isolate for longer, because before they are able to get a vaccine. So maybe they could get a vaccine, but in the meantime they have to isolate in order not to affect others. So there may be other kinds of costs that you could factor in instead of financial costs, because with a financial cost, it's I mean, these are the big differences. The difference between £2 and 20 quid is a difference. You know, it's the difference between a cup of coffee and a takeaway. But these are differences. I mean, in terms of we're not talking the level of costs that we are with, say, expensive cancer drugs or that kind of thing. We're talking about large-scale rollout. But the cost of having to isolate for another 6 weeks, I mean, that's a real cost. That's more than just coughing coming out 20 quid. This is there are real costs, and I agree with you that if somebody has conscientious reasons for choice, then they may have to bear some costs in order to exercise that choice. But I'm suggesting that we might agree that one of the ways in which they show this cost is a cost in terms of inconvenience, not just a cost of a financial sort, because that might be more significant. Okay. Alberto, do you want to say something on this, or shall I?
No, yeah, this is something I hadn't thought about. Yeah, I'm actually not sure I agree, because I agree on that, but we might want to consider the cost. So if a person has to isolate for longer, that might be a cost not just to the person but to other people. So if the person needs to work, if they are dependents, so it's never just about the person. So I agree on the principle, but I'm not sure in practice that would really be a cost that only the person would pay. But I agree on the principle. So it's not about, I agree that it's not necessarily about money. I agree on that, yes.
Okay, great. Some points of agreement. So another question from someone in the audience. I have a huge number of colleagues in the hospital I work in, many on a minimum wage, who due to their faith and beliefs would decline the Oxford vaccine. Does Alberto feel that these individuals, who are compelled to be vaccinated in order to continue working on the wards, should only be offered the choice of alternative vaccines if they are willing to pay for them? If not, where do we draw the line in making allowances for certain individuals?
So these are people working in healthcare settings, right?
Yeah.
Well, at the moment, the vaccine is not mandatory even for healthcare workers anyway. I think it should be mandatory for healthcare. Well, I think it should be mandatory for many categories of people, certainly for healthcare workers. So here the question really is, if the vaccine is mandatory, would that change my approach to the choice? So because I wasn't assuming that the vaccines were mandatory. If the vaccines are mandatory, should people at least be given the choice? No, I think no. So of the 4 groups of people that David identified before, I would be the 4th one. So I don't think that for some people it should be, well, there's a more complicated than this. I wouldn't frame it in terms of right to refuse the vaccine, but I think there should be some form of state intervention to get people vaccinated, some form of mandatory vaccination. But the same considerations apply. So I will give these people freedom of choice if this doesn't entail a large cost to other people and to public health system. But currently, so given this current scarcity, I think healthcare workers should be vaccinated and should get whichever vaccine happens to be available at the moment. So the reason is the same reason I gave before. So the fact that vaccination is mandatory doesn't change the weight of those reasons, because refusing the vaccine or choosing your preferred vaccine might have a public health cost. And if that cost is significant, we shouldn't let people choose whether and how to get vaccinated. I don't see strong enough reasons for, so the question also mentioned workers being on minimum wage. Yeah, I'm not sure how that affects my argument though. I think it's okay to make vaccination a condition for employment. I think it should be that case. And once you do that, the same arguments for not letting people choose, given the current situation, apply. It might be different in the future, not at the moment. I don't know. I'm pretty sure this is where David completely disagrees with me.
Could I ask, and this is a genuine question, it's not, do you think there's a place here for the principle of reciprocity in relation to healthcare workers? So healthcare workers at the moment, they are bearing a lot of cost in terms of danger to themselves, but also trauma and working conditions and so on. And they're doing so for the sake of all of us. So given that they are, as it were, putting themselves out there for us, do you think that that is a consideration, not overwhelming, but a consideration in terms of giving more accommodation for example, things like a choice between vaccines?
Well, I think those you've mentioned are good reasons. So I wrote a paper about this. I think healthcare workers should be paid way more for the risks and the extra time and the extra effort they put in this pandemic. I think there is a principle of reciprocity. So they should be given more benefits, bigger, larger salaries, especially the pandemic. But I don't think that the choice of the vaccine is among the benefits that they should get, because public health reasons matter more. Now, you might say, if we only talk about healthcare workers, the actual cost, so maybe this is something we could agree on. So if we think that we should pay some cost, but not too much, and if we only think about healthcare workers, you might say the cost, if this really only applies to this specific category, maybe the cost for the healthcare system wouldn't be too large because it's a relatively small number of people. Maybe we can afford doing that as a matter of reciprocity. Okay, maybe I would accept, well, it's not I would accept, sorry, but maybe I think it's not up to me. I mean, maybe there are reasons for doing that, yeah. So maybe I should take back the previous answer. If the cost is likely to be small, I would think that reciprocity would maybe imply that we should give them more choice than to other people.
Also, if you're talking about if you're talking about costs which are of the order of £50 or so, then if you think that they should be paid more, then this is going to be much more significant than that amount of money, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah,
the sort of money that you're talking about is not in the scale of giving more reciprocity than the kind of financial consideration isn't a large consideration.
No, yeah, I agree on that. So maybe I'm gonna take it back the previous answer. I agree. That's a good point.
Yeah. Someone asks, or says at least, is the cost differential really such a significant issue? Firstly, the number of people likely to exercise the choice based on conscience is likely to be small. Secondly, my experience is that the NHS does not seem hugely worried about it. As a healthcare practitioner, I had access to either AstraZeneca or Pfizer. At no point did anyone attempt to instruct or persuade me to take the AstraZeneca, let alone mentioning the cost benefits. I don't know whether you want.
Because I always go first. If you want to go first this time, David. But so I will.
All right. Well, I think that I mean, as I said previously, there are other kind of costs involved. I mean, my impression, it is very clear that the stance that the government has, that the NHS has, Department of Health in the United Kingdom, is that the vaccination is not mandatory, not even for healthcare professionals, not even for social care, that's being debated at the moment, but that you don't have a choice of vaccine. They're against a choice of vaccine. And I think that the reasons are not to do with financial costs. The reasons are to do with it becoming too complicated and to do with putting people off. So the more choosy, the BBC has had two stories which are negative about choosing, and they both use the word choosy, which is a pejorative word for choice, because they think that it will I think the more choosy you are, the more hesitant. So you're choosy, you know, I don't have this or this, and when you're deciding, you might hesitate, but also it complicates things. Whereas if you want to have effective rollout, here it is, take it. Bringing choice into it is just going to complicate things. So I think that in terms of public health strategy in the United Kingdom, the reason why people have become very wary of, well, people have been very wary about offering choice isn't about finance, it is about practicalities. But they have been quite strongly discouraged the idea of choice. So I think that there is the question about whether you should have a choice is something to debate, because it has been discouraged, but I don't think it's discouraged because of financial reasons. Do you want to respond to that, Alberto?
Here is something we agree on, that the BBC has done a poor service to this country during this pandemic. I'm not supposed to say this, I don't know, because it's going to be recorded, but I agree that the BBC, let's say, has been not sufficiently professional on many instances in this pandemic. But to get back to the point of the vaccine, I think this is the only thing we can agree on this point. So the question was, so in the question there was this idea that, so the person asking the question was offered a choice. So no one put any pressure on that person to choose the vaccine. Well, if you're in that situation, it means that you are very lucky at this point, but this is not the standard now. So now if you go to get a vaccine, you don't have a choice. You need to get whatever they have there. So when you get to the point where the NHS says, look, there is the AstraZeneca or the Pfizer, pick one, I think that's fine, because it means we can afford to do that. If we get to the point, it means we can afford to do it. But we are not at that point now. So I think that's a bit of a typical case. So that's not what.
Well, I think that if there is a difference between, I mean, this is being on the inside and being on the outside. Yeah. And it's actually the people who are most likely to have a choice actually are the healthcare professionals.
Yeah.
So the healthcare professionals, they know what's being offered where, and they can play the system, as it were.
Yeah,
so
okay.
If you have views, and most people's views, if they have views about this, are not to do with these kind of issues, they're to do with concern about efficacy or sort of a concern about side effects.
Yeah.
And different ways in which they act, then people are doing so. Healthcare workers are deciding to get the vaccine here and in this way rather than there and in that way in order to exercise some kind of choice. But it's not a choice which is offered to the hoi polloi, to the ordinary people who just go along to their GP and they get what they're offered.
Well, maybe we get to that point where we agree on that there is some principle of reciprocity whereby that's fine because you're a healthcare worker. So if we want to apply, that's fine. Let me just say one thing though. So if you're ever in so healthcare workers or not, if you're ever in a situation where you are offered 2 vaccines and other things being equal, so other things, that's important because sometimes people don't give enough weight of these other things being equal. I think you do have a moral obligation to choose, if the vaccine is offered for free, to choose the cheaper one, because you save money to the healthcare system. Other things being equal, risk profile, efficacy. So when you're offered two vaccines, the cost is a relevant consideration. I think you have a responsibility to go for, in this case, for the Oxford one, the AstraZeneca one, because it's the cheapest, other things being equal. Then you say things are not equal because some people have these ethical concerns, and then you need to weigh your ethical responsibility toward the healthcare system, whereas your versus your ethical views on vaccines. So they are both, you have two conflicting ethical duties. And if you have strong reasons of conscience, you think that your duty of conscience to not to go for the one linked to abortion outweighs your duty to not to use too much of public health resources when you have a choice. Then these are the two things that you need to weigh, because there is an ethical duty not to go for the most expensive one if other things are equal, right? Do you agree on that?
No, I think that the situation we have at the moment is that there is a race to get as many people vaccinated as possible. And in order to win this race, they have sourced different vaccines, some of which are more expensive than the other. But the key thing is that they want all the vaccines to be used. And they don't want people not to be vaccinated with a more expensive one. And there don't seem to be, at the moment, in this country, many people for whom one would be acceptable and one not acceptable. There are some people who have some allergies in respect to some, but for the great amount of people, the reason is simply some are more difficult to store, and some are available, and sometimes a place might only discover 2 days before which vaccine they're getting. They say, we're going to have these vaccinations. They don't know which one it is until it arrives, sometimes even.
Yeah, but I was referring to a scenario, like future scenario, where if you are actually offered two vaccines, pick one. So you're referring to the current situation. I think this will be a next stage. Yeah.
If the vaccines all need to be used up, what difference does it make that one is more expensive than the other if they're all going to be used up? No,
I agree on that, but that depends on where. So I was talking about a situation where the actual uptake will drive the supply. So we will have a point where the demand will drive. So if in the UK at some point everyone decides that they don't want the Pfizer or they don't want the AstraZeneca, they only want the Pfizer, then the country will have to purchase only the Pfizer, otherwise people will not get it. So I'm talking about a situation where you have the problem of choosing, not the problem of just getting whatever you have. Right. So there are two different phases of the vaccine rollout.
Okay. So I think there are also some people in the audience who have some questions about mandatory vaccinations. So I'm sure you'd be happy to answer some questions about that. So the question is, Dr. Giubilini touched on mandatory vaccination. I don't know whether this was something he advocates or just mentioned as a possible scenario. If it is a serious suggestion, what would he say to healthcare practitioners who can only treat patients, including vaccinating, with their informed consent? As a healthcare practitioner, I would not be prepared to vaccinate someone against their consent.
Yeah, that's an important question, because when we talk about mandatory vaccination, the first thing that comes to your mind is someone comes to your house and stick a needle, and even if you don't want to. So I don't think we should have that. That's not what I mean by mandatory vaccination. And it's really not up to healthcare providers. It's not their responsibility to make sure people are vaccinated. So mandatory vaccination means that there are some limitations on the freedom of people who refuse the vaccine. So it means you can refuse the vaccine. It's not that a nurse or a doctor comes and gives you the injection if you don't want it. But that comes with some costs. For example, one cost is that if you're not, so in the US, for example, children cannot go to school if they are not up to date with certain vaccines, so the measles, the MMR vaccine, for example. So that's a kind of mandatory vaccination. But parents can choose not to vaccinate their children. It's just that they have to provide to homeschool their children. Now, when we talk about mandatory COVID-19 vaccination, I'm thinking of something like that. If you're not so vaccination passports, for example, is a form of mandatory vaccination, which means if you're not vaccinated, that's your choice, that's fine, but then you cannot travel. Then we have to think about how you apply it. Travel, go to the pub, or I don't know, depends on how strict you want to make it. But it's always about, it's not about healthcare workers giving the injection to someone who doesn't want the injection. That's not what mandatory vaccination is about.
So I agree that there is a distinction here, and there's a whole variety of different kinds of activities that might be restricted, and some activity restriction of some activities is more reasonable than others. If you want to go to various countries, you have to have yellow fever vaccination before you go. They won't let you in without yellow fever vaccination. And passports, in the obvious sense of passports, I mean, travel abroad by aeroplane, that there should be vaccine requirements or vaccine restrictions depending on that. I think that is quite reasonable. I think that making vaccination a requirement for a job is extremely restrictive. I mean, I mean, both legally and ethically, there are questions about exclusion from employment, and I also think, and this is, I mean, we will get to where we differ, but I think this is an issue of where we differ. There's a question of whether it might alienate people, and I do think that the issue of keeping people on board, of trying to broaden the support, the social support for a practice, of making it seem something that people want to buy into rather than something which they feel coerced into. I think that those kind of considerations are relevant when it comes to large-scale public endeavor, and this includes vaccination. So I just raise the pragmatic. It's a pragmatic, instrumental thing. It's not an in-principle thing, but that the no jab, no job thing that some people find it quite alienating, and that loosens the positive campaign in favor of something. Particularly, say, in the United Kingdom, where you do have large-scale support for it. I mean, when maybe in other countries where you've got 50% of people saying that they don't want to be vaccinated, then you've got another kind of problem. But in the United Kingdom, we don't have that problem. And keeping people happy, keeping the country as a whole thinking of it as a good thing, as something that we all want to buy into, something that we share, as opposed to something which is coerced or exclusion, or that. I mean, that also is about a matter of sort of has costs. It's costly. There's a public cost in being more aggressive about how you encourage vaccination.
Yeah, can I just interrupt here, because there was indeed already someone expressed that concern. Someone in the audience expressed such a concern. It's just a summary of the comment, but someone said, like, what should people do who don't want to get vaccinated at all? Are vaccine passports some sort of medical tyranny?
So do you?
Oh, sorry.
No. Do you want to?
Maybe Alberto now, and then David, you can follow up.
No, they're not a form of medical tyranny, because you have the choice, but it's your responsibility to pay the cost for your choice. It's not a medical tyranny. It's not, because it doesn't have to do with the medical profession. As I said before, it's not the medical profession. It's a matter of state policy. If people don't want the vaccine, so there are people who don't want the vaccine. But these people need to realize that they are posing, it's not just about yourself, you're posing a threat to other people. So the thing is that two things we need to bear in mind. First of all, there is no vaccine that is 100% effective. There will always be people who are vaccinated but are not protected. These people need to be protected, and the only way to protect these people is to have as many people as possible around them vaccinated. That's how herd immunity works. Ideally, you want herd immunity. It's difficult with COVID, but
Albert, I'm just going to interrupt you, because the person who wrote this comment also assumed that there was already herd immunity. So maybe you could just say briefly something about that.
Well, there is no herd immunity at the moment. The other thing, but the point about herd immunity is also important. So even if there is herd immunity, so herd immunity is a very unstable condition. We had herd immunity against measles in the UK in children for a few years. Then at some point we stopped having it, and then we had a big problem with measles a few years ago here because vaccination against measles is not mandatory. So the thing is that we need to protect people either those people on whom vaccines are not effective, or those who cannot be vaccinated for medical reasons. Some people have allergies that mean they cannot be vaccinated. We need to have people around them vaccinated. Now, if you don't want the vaccine, you should be aware that you're putting these people at high risk, especially if these people are old and vulnerable in the case of COVID. So I don't think people should be allowed to put other people's life at risk when the cost of doing so is very, very small. So we have accepted a huge cost over the last year with these restrictions, with lockdowns, because we want to protect the vulnerable and therefore the NHS. So we accepted that. We all have been in a lockdown for 1 year. So if that's acceptable, say I'm against lockdown, but I stick to the rules, of course. I'm strongly against lockdown. I don't think it's justifiable. I think this thing is completely unreasonable, but that's the policy. I have to do that. So, and the same, I don't see why the same shouldn't apply to people who are against vaccination. You are opposed to vaccines for whatever reason, but no, if the reason for lockdown is that we need to protect the vulnerable, the same applies to vaccination. Lockdown is mandatory, is not recommended, and so should be vaccination. David's point about mandates possibly backfiring, I agree on that. This is an empirical issue. I agree. If mandatory vaccination backfires, we shouldn't have it, of course. But mandatory vaccination have been shown to be very effective in many cases. In Italy, mandatory vaccination against measles for children dramatically increased vaccine uptake. It is effective if properly implemented. I think also mandatory vaccination will enhance people's trust and confidence in vaccines, because if you do that, people get vaccinated and you see the benefit and you see there is no serious harm to that, then I cannot think of a better way of convincing people that vaccines are a good thing, that showing them that, look, we've done it, here is the benefit, we got rid of COVID-19, for example. So I'm not sure that it's an empirical aspect, but I'm not sure that it will necessarily backfire if we make it mandatory.
I think with passports, depending on what you're talking about, what kind of things you're talking about, but at the moment there's passports to go to the pub is what people are talking about. That obviously raises the question of people forging passports, and particularly say at the moment you have those who are vaccinated are mainly older people. Young people haven't been vaccinated yet. So where you have some large percentage of the population not vaccinated, then you have inequalities in terms of access and exclusion. And so any kind of mandatory system doesn't seem to get a foothold until you get to the stage where you have offered everybody the chance of vaccination, and no country, I mean, even Israel hasn't got there yet. So the concerns about this kind of thing are really after you see how much would be the case if you offered these things voluntarily, and we don't know because we haven't done that yet. So I think it's the coming hard and heavy with mandatory ideas at a time when people don't simply, most people don't have access to the vaccine, doesn't seem to be reasonable.
I agree on that. I agree that that's the main problem with vaccine passports now, because there is some potential for discrimination towards people who haven't been offered a vaccine yet. I agree this is the main problem. Two things though. First of all things considered, maybe some form of discrimination is a cost worth paying, because the benefit of getting the economy running again, getting at least some people safely to the pub, maybe is better than no one. So we don't want a leveling down equality. Mm-hmm. So, and this is also for a short period of time, a few months maybe. But the other thing is that we don't need to have that, because the problem then becomes not so much the passport, but what we do with people who have not been offered the vaccine yet. So we might think that it's not that people who have the passport can go to the pub and people without the vaccine passport cannot. Maybe you might want to have some other requirements, say a recent negative test or proof of previous infection. That is also, it's been proven to last at least 8 months, but probably longer. So you can have, the problem becomes, what do we do with people who don't have the passport yet? But it's not about the passport itself. So it's about trying to reduce as much as possible discrimination and maybe be prepared to pay some cost about unequal treatment for some period, because overall, maybe it's not ideal, but nothing is ideal in this situation. I don't know. We're deviating a bit from the topic of the choice of the vaccine here, but it's interesting because I was sure that this thing would come up at some point. Yeah.
Maybe I'll just mention like a comment by someone that I thought might be just interesting. It may be worth throwing in, as it will complicate the issue. For example, with regard to costs, it is likely that ongoing research will find that for a booster dose, the best protection will be afforded by giving a different vaccine from whichever the individual had first time round. This research is ongoing currently, and we don't know yet if we will require booster doses at all. Just something that could further complicate things.
I'm aware of time, Catherine. Can we have just a brief time to disagree again?
Yes, sure. So we have 3 minutes to disagree.
That's so liberating.
So I just like to say, I think we're agreed that the practical public health considerations are really important, and they're primary important, and choices are kind of secondary importance. But I still think, even though it's a secondary importance, it is a real importance, and it's being neglected altogether at the moment, absolutely altogether. And I do think that by acknowledging it, you do increase the possibility of buy-in. And I mean, I know people who are vaccine skeptics, and I have a sense of the community that you need to reach out to. And I would say that there are people who are easily alienated, and who are already on the edge of being alienated, and where already for some people there are choices. For people in healthcare in this country, there are choices. Then for the small number of people who would want to have a choice, I think that it would be helpful in terms of buy-in. So that's what I'll say. But now over to you for the last
minute. Alberto?
Yeah, so I think, well, just to connect to the last question. So the thing about 2 different vaccines that might be required, that's part of the public health benefit that needs to be put on the table, and we would need to weigh different things. If that's the best way, then maybe that also might matter more than freedom of choice. So I think that the main problem here is that if we do the way that David suggests, I'm not sure that the cost will be small, because there will be many people refusing different vaccines for ethical reasons, and then we might not be able to afford that. Some people might want to refuse the AstraZeneca vaccine for misplaced beliefs about its risks after what happened in Europe. So this mess that Europe did.
Yes, yeah.
Now, this would also count as an ethical reason in many cases, because people will think, I don't want to take this risk. So I have family, I have duties toward my family. I don't want to take a perceived, non-existent, but perceived unnecessary risk with the AstraZeneca vaccine, for example. So if we consider these things among the ethical consideration, the ethical objections, then people with ethical concerns around the vaccines are really, really a lot. And I don't think we will be able to afford that. But that's probably where we disagree. It's good to end with a disagreement.
I think we'll have to end here, but I would like to thank both of you for this amazingly interesting discussion. And I think it's really fantastic to have 2 academics who disagree so much together, and that you just try to agree on some points to move this debate forward. So I think that's just fantastic. And I also would like to thank the audience, of course, for being here and for the questions in the Q&A. I'm sorry for that I couldn't ask all the questions. There's just not enough time for that. So yeah, thank you very much for this.
Thank you.